Before we get started, I would like to give a brief acknowledgement of country. Today, we're meeting across University of Tasmania, Aboriginal land, sea and waterways, and of course online. I acknowledge with deep respect the traditional owners of this land, the Palawa people, and all traditional owners of all lands from which we gather today. I recognise a history of truth which acknowledges the impacts of invasion and colonisation upon Aboriginal people, resulting in the forcible removal from their lands. I stand for a future that profoundly respects and acknowledges Aboriginal perspectives, culture, language, history and knowledge, and a continued effort to fight for Aboriginal justice and rights, paving the way for a strong future. And with that in mind, I'd like to welcome our guest from Central Queensland University, Professor Michael Cowling, who is also the Senior Editor of the Ed Tech section of the Journal of University Teaching and Learning Practice, and our own Dr Joey Crawford, the Senior Lecturer at UTAS in the College of Business and Economics, as well as the Editor-in-Chief of the aforementioned journal and the President of Open Access Publishing Association. Welcome, everybody. I'll leave it to you to talk about impact.
Perfect, thank you, Nat, and hello to those I haven't met before, and those that I can see a few familiar faces in the audience, or at least names. I'll just share my screen. Today, I think we've got a really interesting conversation to talk to, and I suspect many of you are coming in from different walks of life around the concept of open access and your engagement with open access. And I'll try not to re-explain parts of that wheel to you and try to connect in with some of the stories and narratives that we've been working with, unpacking and unraveling in our journal world, and also within the context of open access publishing more broadly. I suspect perhaps with slight degree of bias and perhaps the right mindset, our argument remains that open access publishing is something that is quite important to practice, and it's the conversation that we have around this time each year and in formal settings, but it's something that Mike and I have been working on in various for the last decade or more in Mike's context, in thinking about how we create spaces and places that people can publish and that knowledge can be accessible and open. Some of the conversations we'll talk to today speak to things about what credible research looks like in the open access context. And we also provide some cautionary tales and try to disentangle the fact that not all open access in and of itself is good. Not all subscription and paid spaces are also bad. So I go back just a quick moment as we work our way through to provide context for where we came from. And there was two quite important journals that existed in the 1600s. And if you look at the stories and narratives around how these journals formed, it was a group of primarily white professors and scholars, or in the French context, they call them savants, from a learned society, and that learned society got together and said, actually, we should be writing down what we're doing and working out how we share it. And so formed letters or small journal correspondent spaces for the members to publish among themselves and share in almost a very small newsletter form. I think the Philosophical Transactions was an A5, a very small document that was handwritten or probably typewritten in those spaces, and was only shared with members and only shared with subscribers. And these typically were not very accessible and open, and over time conversations around the nature of open access emerged, but generally attributable, the Journal of Medical Internet Research was the first major journal to be given open access, to provide open access space, although I suspect there were probably a few less than known ones in and around that time as well and before. So we actually haven't been doing open access very long. The concept hasn't been around very long when you compare that to the history of journals and when you compare that to the history of publishing. But in the early 2000s, we started to normalize some of the conversations around open access, and we started, and there was three kind of key activities that happened around the same time that spoke to open access in Budapest in 2002, and another one in the mid part of 2003, and again in Berlin in October of 2003. And many of these, and you look at kind of the language that's inside of some of these statements, and they spoke to the principle and the idea that knowledge should be accessible and available to all. And if you remove the publishing from the equation, you speak to knowledge, a lot of the statements that are inside and the clauses inside of these statements speak primarily to the idea that we should have knowledge that is accessible, and that actually no one really owns or has an ownership right to the concept of knowledge, and that in many cases we should be working out how we engage with conversations of intellectual information in places that we can all find it and see it. And we know it's growing. We know that since about 2002, when we started to have conversations about open access, organizations and practitioners have been trying to produce spaces that open access is becoming more important. Lewis, in a review and then a prediction, made comment in 2012 that about half of the published literature by somewhere around 2017 and 21 should become open access, and almost all of it will be open access by 2025 at the conservative level. We see another study from 2018 that speaks to this concept that in their scenario, they did a historical analysis of 100,000 randomly sampled articles, and they used that to identify that about 28% of scholarly literature in that time period was open access, perhaps a little bit behind the levels that Lewis was predicting. But interestingly, in the 2015 period, that sample wasn't, it was 45%. The highest year in their sample was their last year, providing some at least indicative evidence that open access is growing, and our engagement with open access is growing quite quickly. 2019, we then saw again that these numbers were higher. So 63% in the UK. But the interesting comment that's being made in this particular piece is that Australia seems to not be doing so well comparatively, at least in the 2019 context, where compared to a number of other places that are high producers of knowledge, we do not seem to be as good at developing and sharing our knowledge in an open access forum. And I suspect I was trying to find, as part of this slide, and you can see there's a bit of a white empty space in the right-hand corner. I was trying to find some stats on the COVID scenario, because it's likely there was a huge push from places like the World Health Organization to produce anything that related to COVID as open access and available and stored within the WHO repository for that. And we started to see some of these elements become driving forces for an agenda that was about responding to COVID, but actually probably had some positive implications for the field and the practices of open access. But I think it's really important to recognize that when we talk about open access, we don't just mean all places where we put information that's free, easy to access, and engaged with. The most common open access space is the gold nature of open access. The most common way that we talk about open access is this idea that someone is still paying. So in a gold context of open access, it is still available to everyone. So you don't need to pay to access it. But usually in a gold environment, the publisher retains the primary space where that article or knowledge is stored. The author or the institution of the author pay for that research and commission that research. And so there is usually someone who's paying up front for engagement with that open access commentary. The neuroimage case study is a really good example about where that might have gone wrong, with a reasonably large and high-profile journal seeing all their 40 editors resign following changes from a journal that was once not open access to being open access, but being open access in a gold context, and the editors not believing that the fee for that particular service was fair or reasonable. Elsevier, and this Kennedy is one of the editors that resigned that was quoted. Elsevier responded to that comment saying that they met an industry standard price for open access in the gold publishing world. Green open access tends to be a little bit less frequent, but becoming a little bit more common, where journals allow authors to engage with things like self-archiving publicly, so we can then go put onto our university repositories and engage and share it there, and it can be available for there as well as in the space of the journal or the publishing space as well. Sometimes, usually someone has to pay for that. In the same way that gold is the case, often the context there is that they expect that someone will pay for that. It's often more than the gold open access because you're taking the information away from the host journal and putting it somewhere else. And if you kind of go back about 5 years, that typically had an embargo period on it, and it was quite normal to have availability to reshare, but you couldn't reshare it for an X number of years following the publication, to allow the publisher to essentially recoup its costs associated with publishing. Although cost is perhaps a questionable comment given some of the numbers that we see those publishers producing. And Diamond, which is the one that remains quite uncommon, but is perhaps my preferred approach to open access. And it's that the journals are free for readers and they're free for authors. And this is quite challenging because it means that someone has to fund the concept of knowledge production without knowing what knowledge production will look like outside of it being future articles being created space for. In these cases, you typically have something like some volunteer scholars engaging as editors and reviewers. You have a non-commercial practice, and you might have some cooperative access. There are a number of journals that are purely funded by institutions. So they're funded by an institution for the purpose of being Diamond open access, and they're looked after by editors within that institution, at least in their inauguration space, and they might expand out beyond that context. All of which have pros. The pro of all of them, I suppose, is that it is open access. The limitations is that someone is still paying for the commissioning of that research along the way, and it's about us assessing perhaps the direction of where that money is and isn't, and where it's useful and important. And this is where I think we start with Mike.
Thank you for that, Joey. So yeah, I think Joey's done a good job there sort of mapping out the history for you. And I think what really struck me when we started looking at those stats is how short a time we've had for open access publications. We're talking about the true open access journals really only having existed for 25 or 30 years. So this is something that we're pushing against pretty hard, I think, in the 21st century, but I think there's still a bit of work to do. And it's been so sort of embedded in our culture that there are even places where people sort of criticize the idea. And this slide here on the left-hand side actually has a comic from a very, very famous comic creator. You might know him, Jorge Tam, who writes a comic called PhD Comics, which kind of satirizes this idea of what we're doing in academia and breaks it down and says, well, this is really a bit crazy, right? Essentially, as scientists, we do the work for nothing. We also review the work generally for nothing. And then we take that work and we hand this work to a publisher like Elsevier or whoever it might be, who then charge our institution often for access to that work. And it's crazy that we do that. It's crazy that we provide all of the labor and that we provide all of that work. But the publishers are ultimately the ones that make a profit out of it. But of course, we as academics, we do that because of the whole publish and perish idea, right? This idea that we would like our work to be published, and this is the current model for how it actually happens. And Joey highlighted that, right? It's interesting, that idea that from the 1600s, we've had these small scale journals that were only available to members and subscribers. We had this situation where if you wanted access to this research, you had to pay for it, and that was predominantly because it was paper, it was old fashioned, right? It's only in the last 20 years that we've ended up with the internet and a situation where we don't necessarily have to do that. And I think it's taking us a little bit of time to get our head around that model. And Joey outlined those different layers, of course, where I think essentially it would be reasonable to say that the publishers have recognized that we want to make things open access and are trying to work out a way that they can still make money out of that with something like gold publishing. But as academics, we're all sort of saying, well, why don't we just make this stuff free to everybody? Why don't we just make this stuff available? And I know the university still ultimately is paying us to do the work. But I think as academics, we're quite idealistic, and we would like that ultimately this happens. So I've summarized that on the right-hand side of this slide, that sort of satirical idea that Jorge shared, which is that institutions pay the salaries of the authors. The authors then publish their work. The institutions then pay to access the research written by the people that work for them. And then the publishers then are ultimately the ones that profit from it. And that just seems, to me anyway, as a bit of a crazy model. So our proposal, our suggestion, and it's not just Joey and I, but I think the industry as a whole, is that we should move towards a model of open access. And so I'll get Joey to click the button for me. Because ultimately what this means is that institutions pay the salaries of the authors publish, but that everybody has access. And then idealistically, when we talk about open access publications, that means that the community profits, society profits in some way. And Joey and I, as part of this, to very much prove our thesis in the beginning, right? With why is publishing in closed journals smothering your impact? Went out and we had a look and we said, well, is this true? And there's varying different levels of research. There are some papers out there that suggest that there's not a big difference with open access journals, but there is some research out there that suggests that open access journals are places that you would like to publish your work if you'd like to get more citations, if you'd like to get more eyeballs on your work. And ultimately, again, as idealistic academics, that's probably what we want. And so the Bajork and Solomon article that you can see there was from 2012, about 10 years ago. Again, remember that we're talking maybe a decade after we really started with open access publications. And they recognized that whilst impact factors for open access publications were not as good as impact factors for closed access publications, that they were growing and they were substantial, right? So the idea that something was open access didn't mean that it would not be cited, did not mean that people weren't interested in it. All we were doing is we were changing the way that people were accessing it. And then if we kind of work our way forwards, we can see that jump in 2014 recognized that open access articles published in Nature Communications between April 2010 and June 2013 were actually cited more often in terms of the median compared to the median for subscription articles. So we're talking a median of 11 times for the open access publications versus 7 times for the subscription-only articles. Now, again, you've got to be a little bit careful with that statistic. I guess if you're going to pick a journal to analyze Nature, or a Nature journal is a good one to use. But the issue, of course, there is that somebody's still getting paid, right? Those Nature communications may be gold, probably are gold, and so there is still a payment going to the publisher there. But it's a good evidence, the fact that just because you're making it open access does not mean that it's not going to be cited. And then, of course, as we get our way very close, right, to 2021, so we're talking a couple of years ago now, we're able to recognize very clearly from that Clayson reference that the articles that are open access do get more citations, 9 to 21% more citations, and 39% more altmetric mentions. And this is in the field of electrophysiology. And I think that's really interesting for a couple of reasons. Number one is it gives us a number, 10 to 20% more citations for open access articles academically, which is great, right? But as well as that, it also demonstrates that impact outside of the academic field as well, because the altmetrics measures are going to be a little bit wider. When we're talking about altmetrics, we're probably talking about other things than just people mentioning us in journals via citations, mentioning us on social media, mentioning us in other places. And people are probably doing that because they know that if they provide a DOI, if they provide a link to that journal paper, somebody's going to actually be able to read it. Anyone is going to be able to read it, from the general public, from anywhere. They don't necessarily have to be working for one of those universities that have signed up for one of those subscriptions that we talked about before. And so I think the argument is that there is a profit in open access. I don't think it's necessarily a slam dunk at this point, although we're getting closer, but I think there's definitely good evidence there that it is growing, that there is value in open access publications. But of course, I'm preaching to the converted, because everybody that's listening to me thinks that open access publications are a good idea. The challenge, of course, is getting away from the publishers and also convincing the institutions that this is true. I do feel, though, here that I do need to make a caution, which is that, and I've picked a couple of journals here that are a couple of journal publishers here that are commonly sort of pointed out when we talk about this. I'm not going to get too far into the weeds in terms of talking about whether or not MDPI or Frontiers are predatory journals, but it is worth noting that those large journal publication organizations like MDPI have also worked out that open access publications can be more cited, more open, something that academics actually want. And so they have pushed towards this model of open access publication, which is not in essence bad, right? Again, open access publication is a good thing in general, but we just need to be very cautious that all of the same measures and checks and balances that exist for those closed journals also exist for open access journals as well. So just because you become an open access journal, just because you make your material available to everybody, doesn't mean that you don't still have a competent reviewers, that you don't have a competent editorial team, that you don't reject articles that are not up to the level that you would expect from your journal. And you still need to do that even if you're focused on open access. I guess what I'm essentially saying is don't forego the quality just because you make the decision that you're going to become open access. And as I said to you, just to finish us off, it's worth noting that Australia has still got to do a little bit more work here. And this is where Joey and I get into maybe perhaps a little bit of a plug for you, which is that we're interested in talking a little bit more about what we've done, and also what Australia is doing as a whole. So let me talk to you first about what we're doing. And Nat didn't mention in the introduction, but I wear a couple of different hats. I am the senior editor for JUDL, the Journal of University Teaching and Learning Practice, which Joey is the editor-in-chief of. But I'm also the president-elect for Ascolite, and Ascolite runs a journal called the Australasian Journal of Educational Technology, or AJET. And AJET, for at least all of the time that I've been involved with Ascolite, is a fully open access journal. And when we were looking up some stats here, I was surprised Joey found out that this journal's been around for a lot longer than I thought it had, 1976. But because of that, it's a very popular journal. It is the #1 education journal in Australia. It's a Q1 journal, if you know what that means, and was joint scopus in 2009 as a Q2, but became a Q1 in 2010. It is an international journal from 2004, but most importantly, it's open access. It is fully open access. Diamond open access, I suppose, would be the way we would describe it. And how do we do that as Ascolite? Well, we subsidize it through fees from the society, right? So society recognized a long time ago, much longer back than when I became involved in the society, that there was value in making these papers available to everybody via open access and not charging our authors for those to work on those papers either, so to publish those papers either. And so basically you can publish in AJET. It doesn't cost the authors anything, it doesn't cost the readers anything, and the money that we spend to fund the journal is funded from the society as a whole. But that doesn't mean that we trade in the quality. I mean, obviously the journal, as I mentioned, is a Q1 journal. It's a very popular education journal in Australia. And we have a reputation for having a high-ish rejection rate. And it takes us a while to review articles as well. In fact, probably a little bit longer than I'd like, because our reviewers and our editors do their job seriously. And so we don't compromise the quality just in order to have an open access journal. But ultimately, by doing so, we have this great journal that allows us to publish great practice in educational technology, which is the area that AJET focuses on. And then, as I mentioned to you, Joey and I are involved with Juddle as well, and Joey's the editor-in-chief, and it's a slightly younger, quite a bit younger journal, which started local institutionally in 2004, joined Scopus in 2017, and then under the stewardship of editors-in-chief, various editors-in-chief, most recently Joey, has slowly worked its way up from Q3 in 2018 to a bunch of new international editors in 2020, and then a Q2 journal in 2021, and maybe a Q1 journal sometime soon. Keep your fingers crossed. And so we're doing some great work. I think great work. We're unbiased, of course, but we're doing some work there with Juddle as well to try and sort of expand this idea beyond educational technology. I'm responsible for the educational technology section, but there are all sections focused on educational psychology and educational leadership and curriculum and assessment and teaching practice. And Joey's going to get upset with me because I'm probably going to miss one there. I'm sure I have. He'll type it in the chat. You watch. Student experience. There you go. I knew I missed one. And but the idea, of course, again, is that it is entirely free. It is open access, right? And it is open access in terms of both the authors and the readers as well. And we did that because, we did that. I say we, but again, it was before my time. Juddle did that by becoming tethered to an institution, by allowing an institution to help with some of that work and some of that cost. And Joey might talk to you about that a little bit more in a couple of slides. And so that's kind of what we're doing. And ultimately that means that AJET and Juddle represent almost 40% of education publications and are number 2/3 by 2-year citations, which I know sounds like a little bit of a plug. And it is a little bit of a plug, but I think also really very much an opportunity to provide you with some evidence that becoming open access and becoming Diamond open accessed is something that you can do in order to and still be successful as a journal. So I think this last one is my last slide, which is just a recognition though that it is still early days. So here in Australia, when we talk about these kinds of things, we're really talking about only about 25 to 30% of journals listed in various different databases being open access. So Scopus, for example, 58 are open access out of the 202 that are listed in Scopus. Web of Science, 38 are open access out of the 120 that are listed in Web of Science. And so it is still predominant. The majority of journals are still closed access journals, despite the fact that it's recognized that the top 5 of 11 World of Science education journals by 2-year impact are actually open access. And so we recognize that we have those citations and we recognize that there is value in being open access. But I think, and this is just me spitballing, I think that we're pushing against 400 years of history. And I think it's going to take us a while and a bit of work to convince people that that closed access journals are smothering our impact, and that there is value in us being open access. But Joey and I are working on that. So I'm going to hand back to Joey, and he's going to talk to you a little bit about how we're working on that.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And some of those comments I think were quite important and quite useful in us thinking about the context and landscape that open access exists inside of. We do use language about open access being inherently good, and I think it is inherently good, but there is actually some different ways of thinking about it, and there's different approaches. And as Mike said, Australia still sits a bit behind the 8 ball in terms of where we are actually progressing in engaging with open access. I would be quite curious to see some of those stats being redone from what level of open access do those journals engage in, because there aren't a huge volume of diamond open access organizations. And Juddle was from the start. Juddle was a diamond open access organization from the start, insofar as it was a small journal that was based out of the University of Wollongong, and it was funded almost as a project to allow local University of Wollongong staff to publish and to engage in work. And as it's grown in size and volume, and it's published less and less from the University of Wollongong over time, the priority has changed, and the scoping has changed. And that's reflected in its editorial team, it's reflected in what it publishes, and it's reflected in its impact. And this is where Mike and I and others have started to get together to ask questions about how we might actually do this a little bit better at scale, and start to build infrastructure that might support journals that are on that same trajectory, whether it's journals that are coming from small universities and they're trying to move into spaces and retain their open access nature. In our case, University of Wollongong is interested in and has wanted to offload the Juddle resource component from its profile. And there's a number of universities that do this over time, that it can be expensive to run large scale journal systems. And so we've asked questions about what we might do about that, and what we might do to support a space where at some point there could be spaces, there could be charities or organizations that have resource profiles that can support these journals in perpetuity without requiring the journal to have a financial resource constraint, i.e. money coming from institutions, money coming from authors. That really does challenge our ability to access data, because open access data that is gold really does privilege, and there's a lot of evidence to support, really does privilege people from higher wealth institutions and higher wealth backgrounds, because people who can pay for the open access space. Sometimes I think Nature Communications, as Mike was talking about before, I think it's $7,000 or $8,000 or something about that for its open access fee. The Elsevier one that led to resignations, I think, was just short of $4,000. And there are some that range upwards of $15,000 and $16,000 per article. So we got together and we formed a parent for the Journal of University Teaching and Learning Practice. And the parent Open Access Publishing Association, not-for-profit, that was designed for us to say, how do we actually generate resources that could actually support us to run our journal without ever having to ask people in the journal sphere itself to contribute financial resources to it? Because the second we have money attached to some publications or no publications, some publications or some spaces, it changes the way that knowledge is constructed, and it adds a layer of bias. And we know that places that have less resources are more likely to prioritize open access free locations. And we see that in some of our profile. We have a large representation of publications from Africa, then many journals that have paid spaces, and from South America and other areas that don't have the same university financial backing to produce papers that are high profile and pay for them to be published. So we've been thinking about how we do this. In our context, we're running at the moment an editor training program that's coming through this year, and a number of universities have come on board to run an edit and sent along some of their staff to engage in editor training. a practice that we also know is an important foundation for a good publishing community is that if I've been doing this for a number of years in the journal where we train editors as they enter the journal, but preparing academics who are interested in being editors for a various and diverse range of journals they might occupy might actually help us get better as a country at least and globally at being able to respond to some of the editor challenges that we're facing. So we're doing some short courses in and around publishing and trying to build the quality of that. Not attached to our journal specifically, but again, aligned, and some of the journal editors do contribute to those courses. There are some memberships, just like Atholite, and one of the key ways that organizations are funded, and some seminar series that we do as well. And again, these do have relationships with the journal and potentially other journals that we will create space for joining when they do have the same challenge financially that Juddle had faced as we work our way forwards, to make sure that we do have a space that people can, groups of academics can form journals, build journals, and have the minimum resource requirements to be able to run that without actually needing to seek out a financial backing from a particular place or space. And this kind of gets towards the end of the comment that I was going to make here, and it's one of the things that I think we have to do a bit more actively in the open access space. The way that we will support greater impact for research that's good is about thinking about how we decouple the concept of institutional publisher ownership and revenue from knowledge management and creation. And this is a bit of a two-way street in many ways. The market, so the academics that are going and publishing, choosing to go to places that are higher profile diamond open access and places that actually supporting those, because we know that as those organizations or those journals increase in their impact factor, their relevance within the community grows. And we've seen Juddle's a really good example of that. I joined as the editor, as the senior editor, I think about 5 years ago. And it, as a journal, has kind of about tripled its impact in the last period of time as we've diversified our editor profile and as we've engaged in thinking quite carefully around how we do effective editing without requiring financial resources from a person who's controlling that knowledge dissemination. And so from an author point of view, being able to choose spaces that are relevant and really important for an open access community is quite useful. And as well, from a reviewer point of view, choosing to review for journals that are open access is a way that you can contribute to that community and provide, empower those communities to engage, but also those with institutional resources trying to work out ways to support and fund and engage with open access spaces that really matter. I think we stopped there, and the intention was, I think, to stop a little bit early so we could talk about, there's obviously a website and our contact details if you happen to have any follow-ups or questions you wanted to talk through in our context. But we wanted to stop a bit early to create space for questions and discussion and the opportunity to talk about things that we might have missed or questions that you might have from the things that we said.